My name is Sarah Luehrman in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard, and I am interviewing Professor Jon Snyder today from the University of California at Santa Barbara, who has just published this book called Dissimulation and the Culture of Secrecy in Early Modern Europe. So I guess the first question I should ask you is to talk about what dissimulation is in practice, because you've focused your book very, very narrowly, I would say, on the discourse of dissimulation, so the way that people talked about it and wrote about it. So can you give us sort of an introduction to that?
The book is about the terms of representation of dissimulation in the 16th and 17th centuries. What do I mean by that? I mean that dissimulation itself, that is to say, when people successfully did something to hide, to dissimulate, to disguise an intention, an emotion, a thought, those acts are lost to us. We can't possibly recover them because if they're successful, they're invisible and they vanish.
Right.
So what I look at instead is the way in which the idea of dissimulation was put into discourse, how it was discussed, how it was defined, how it was defended, how it was justified, because, as the rest of the book then tries to argue, it touches on some of the most important aspects of early modern culture, including the question of what a subject is and what the parameters of subjectivity are in the early modern period, in which things are changing very, very quickly between the early 16th and the early 18th century. So the book is an attempt to talk about the discourse of dissimulation, because that's what we can see today.
Right, right. And the way you've organized it is sort of following along that path. You've organized it sort of on three, well, in my view, in three basic levels of early modern society. So sort of the person engaging in everyday civil life with other people, the person at court sort of interacting with other courtiers and with the prince, and then the ruler himself, who is kind of at the top of all this, and that's probably sort of the weightiest chapters, is where you really get into political dissimulation. So can you talk a little bit about how you came to this scheme of organization and why it made the most sense?
There was an early 17th century text by a guy named Machon, a 17th century ecclesiastic, in which he himself establishes a typology of dissimulation between civil, moral, and political dissimulation. So I looked at that for a while and I thought, well, there's something missing here, which is the court, of which he was a member, and, well, a very marginal member, but still, nonetheless, that was clearly the dissimulated part of his typology of dissimulation. So I thought, well, this really is the most effective way to try to get a handle on a very polyvalent, very complex and multifaceted part of early modern culture. We can break this down into these various, how should we call it, these various sectors of the discourse on dissimulation. So civil dissimulation is really the civil conversation. It's what comes out of politeness. It's what comes out of the society of buona creanza, of bon ton, of etiquette, courtesy, if you will. All of those things play into the civil conversation, in which people dissimulate constantly. And writers on writers from De la Casa and Guazzo on are very frank about that. That if you didn't doff your hat in the street to someone who you detest, you might trigger an act of violence. And that would be bad, not only for you personally, but it would be very bad for society as a whole. So dissimulation is a way of reducing violence or the potential for violence within society. It's a kind of social lubricant, as it were, within the civil conversation. From that, then, it's one step further to arrive at moral dissimulation or honest dissimulation, or individuals within the civil conversation who are trying to stay in the conversation, as you must do with dissimulation. The difference between dissimulation and silence being that if you're silent, you can't really dissimulate very successfully because people will notice that you're being silent. So you have to stay in the conversation, but arrive at a kind of 0 degree of communication in so doing, keeping yourself to yourself, and yet at the same time, you are fully in the world, as it were, which would be the world of social interaction, social exchanges. The honest dissimulators, drawing more on a neo-Stoical tradition, try to pull back as much as they can in order to keep a space for themselves. And I find that a very interesting moment in the history of early modern culture, in which people begin to try to stake out a barrier, however permeable it may be, between an internal and, well, let's call it the experience of interiority, if you will, and this radically exteriorized world of social interaction, which is the civil conversation. From that, then, the court is radically different. If the civil conversation arises in 1,000 different places, the court is in one place. And so you have a continuum at court where everyone is there. Of course, people are coming and going, but there's a continuum of interaction where people see you day in and day out, acting and interacting in a number of different ways. And so the parameters are different. And of course, the court is the place of ambition. And that in itself triggers a vast anti-court literature in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Right.
Finally, then, political dissimulation is the person at the top of the pyramid in the old regime is obviously going to be the dynastic ruler, or it could be, political dissimulation is basically reason of state. In other words, who's justified in dissimulating state secrets for what reason? I mean, these are the questions that are asked in political dissimulation in the reason of state dialogue discourse. And starting, again, with Machiavelli, you can follow through right into the late 17th century, this very intense debate in Europe about the prince and the prince's right to secrecy, right to privacy, and in essence, a right to keep to himself.
The entire book is a very nicely woven, close reading of all of the big names and some of the smaller names too in the 16th and 17th century who were talking about this very directly. Do you trust them?
That's a wonderful question. Do you trust me?
Well, I'll get to that. I had another question about that.
Because this is what happens in the play that I talk about at the end of the, that would be the end of the 4th chapter.
Right.
There's a play by Ricciardi, Chi non sa fingere, non sa vivere. And in that play, this is exactly what happens. They begin to talk about dissimulation. Yeah. They finally lapse into complete paranoia and fall apart, fall away from each other, and find themselves totally isolated and cut off from common ground, as it were. I think I do trust them to be talking not about the way in which someone performed an act of dissimulation, successfully or unsuccessfully, but
there's very little of that.
And there's very little of that.
Yeah.
But rather, and there's examples drawn from antiquity more than anything there. And occasionally something, Louis XI was considered a master dissimulator, the Spider King, and so forth. There are a few figures like that, but not a lot. But rather to look at what they felt it was legitimate to discuss, what they felt it was legitimate to talk about. In other words, what were the parameters and the norms that obviously were circulating in the society, and which they were pushing up against in these discourses. And I think that is, I mean, if you go all the way back to, you know, the early 1980s, I mean, it's 30 years almost, you know, to something like Foucault's idea of problematization. That is, how is it that something becomes a problem for a society? And in essence, that's one of the driving forces behind the book, to see how dissimulation emerges, but not as a series of acts, but as a series of discourses indicating that there's a problem.
Talking about the difference between us and them, as it were, where you say that today the media-saturated society of the West, built around the principle of publicity, cannot tolerate even the slightest suspicion of dissimulation in those persons who are chosen to be put profitably on display. Never have seeming and being been more perfectly merged than they are now, or so most would want and be expected to think. Perhaps, however, it is time to think again. So, excuse me for quoting you directly on that, but it seems like maybe there was there was something in particular that made you think this is something important to write about now.
Well, I mean, I think this is the work of the cultural historian, no? That we can, if we look at that particular cultural formation, which is finished, there is no discourse on dissimulation anymore. We've moved into a post-romantic world where there's a discourse on sincerity that you can see in interviews, you can see it in talk shows, you can watch Oprah. You know, tears have become the new mode of communication in our world of the same emotions that people were probably experiencing in dissimulation, only then the tears flowed inwardly, and now they have to flow outwardly. I'm tempted to mention this week's New Yorker, since you asked me that question, which has the weekly humor piece is about a guy who decides to tweet his wedding day and wedding night uninterruptedly, and you know, this is where we're going. And I think, and now Twitter is allowing you to pay for your tweets to go up to the top. See, because you'll pay, but you'll actually make money by reaching the top of the publicity pyramid, if you will, or the top of the publicity ladder. And so, and that's all based on supposedly what you're revealing about yourself. Now, we know that that's not necessarily true. These images can be manufactured, obviously. However, the point is that our society is driving in that direction. And we want to know more and more. And the more we know about a celebrity's life, the more we want to know. Right. So we could talk about a voyeuristic culture, but we'd really be getting off track. And the point is simply that this is a cultural formation, a historical formation, that can give us pause. It can give us something to think about.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here.